Hello, in today's video we're going to look at two candidates' piece of work on exactly the same description question. So write a description of a stormy sea as suggested by this picture. So both candidates have done that. There are 24 marks for the content and 16 marks for accuracy. Now if you've watched my other videos you'll know that I teach you not to get locked into the photograph unless you absolutely have to. You can see how these students have both spent time planning by their use of the picture, and I'm guessing that you would suggest that this candidate is going to be better than this candidate because this one is messy. And that's your first mistake, because your plan isn't marked. Your plan is there for you to get ideas down as quickly as possible. This candidate has taken more time and been more neat, whereas this one has worked much more quickly. Because you don't get marks for it, you only get marks for what you write. So this candidate is able, therefore, to get higher marks. Okay, the next thing you should notice is that both examiners have annotated the beginning, the opening. And that's not a coincidence. That happens because the examiner wants to make up their mind as quickly as possible. And by the time they've read that much, they have genuinely made up their mind what mark they're going to give you. And then they're just reading the rest of your answer in order to see if they were right. So they might change their minds, but they're not going to change it by that much. So if you craft your first paragraph brilliantly, you will force them to give you higher marks. Well, let's have a look at this one first. Roars of thunder echoed loudly through the stormy sky on the island. It was as though the elements of sky and water worked together to punish the land. So we've got very good personification there. Alliteration has been chucked in with the stormy sky. Well-chosen vocabulary with the elements. Starting sentences in interesting ways with roars rather than the. Huge gushes of wind attacked the defenseless trees. So there is a slight sense that you're writing a typical description here. There's nothing unusual in it. Let's see what the better candidate did. The darkness encapsulated the light, blanketing any sense of hope. And so this is more sophisticated because it's moving away from the physical description to what you will actually feel. As a grey mass crept across the sky. And here you've got a much more powerful metaphor in the personification of the grey mass just inching across the sky slowly. From above, everything was silent save the water beneath the sky. And here you can see the sibilance of the S's is more powerful than the more simple alliteration of stormy sky here, where the sibilance doesn't add anything. That alliteration of the S, the sibilance, doesn't really create any emotion, whereas here it creates the sound of this weather closing in. So you can see, hopefully, that this is more effective as a piece of description. And unfair though it might seem, the examiners confirmed their opinion straight off. This is a writer who's really crafting their language. This is a writer who's using the right techniques, but not really sure about why and how effective to make them. And there's another point that I should make. This writing simply looks more like that of an expert. It's much more frequently joined up, not all the time, but it feels fluent. You get the sense of a writer writing at speed. Whereas here, the more rounded letters suggest that this is a writer who's spending more time thinking. They don't feel as fluent. Now again, that's hopelessly unfair, but that is how examiners think. So you need to develop a handwriting that's not necessarily messy, but more convincingly joined up. And the more you join up your handwriting, the more like an expert you'll seem. You've got plenty of time to do that between now and the exam. You could practice it for 5 minutes in every single lesson that you have. And then, the next week, build it up to 8 minutes, and the week after that up to 15 or whatever. And so by the time you hit your exams, you can be writing in joined up handwriting constantly. Don't neglect that and think it doesn't matter. It does. Okay, let's compare the next paragraph. So we had elements of sky and water work together. We got that far. Raw! Exclamation mark. That feels a bit childish, even though it is a one-sentence paragraph. It doesn't really add anything. This sentence is more effective. Thunder echoed every 2 minutes as though it was God giving out orders. Thick, murky clouds covered the once blue sky, and the commas aren't correct here. Pellets of water spat to the ground as though they were better than it. Now that's actually a really lovely bit of description. This idea that the weather feels superior and spat at the ground, that personification really works. The examiner seems to have ignored it, but never mind. The devil blue ferociously slammed against the rocks, brutal and merciless, leaving the rocks with little but a glistening sample of itself. The repetition stabbed the possibility of light, providing the land with eternal darkness. So you can see this writer is almost trying too hard in their description, and the examiner simply ignored it. It's not really impressed them, and that's probably why it's not going to get top marks. Here again, you've got the similar thing. The writer's trying too hard, although I do really like this personification here. Let's look at the next paragraph. The sea was spilling in furious waves against the rocks, trying to swallow the land whole. So this appropriate use of linguistic devices, plural, links to that personification here. This is a new personification. Each clear speck of water crashed into land, wanting to escape. More personification. Killer waves were coming from as far back to the horizon anyone could see. Slightly clumsy phrasing. The midnight blue sea danced along as the waves took over, filling every crack, and that should be cranny rather than nanny, of the rocks with clear blue liquid. So now here the writer's losing their effect. It was threatening before, and now it's not threatening, it's dancing along, it's quite happy. It's like Cinderella at midnight. And so it's losing its impact. We've gone from fury to not threatening in any way. And clear blue liquid is something that you'd happily drink. So this writer has now lost the effect. Let's see if it's an effect that's maintained here. The strong smell of salt rebelliously forced itself into every crevice. So you can see here the examiner is thinking, oh, come on, you're just chucking a sense in here. You're doing it because you have to. And that again stops it being a top piece. But what this writer is doing is deliberately looking for really interesting and challenging vocabulary, which is interestingly giving them high spelling marks because these are words which are difficult to spell. Covering every inch of the air in its thick, heavy scent. The taste of peeling paint led the eye to the distant lighthouse, a star in the gloomy sky. So there's a metaphor of the lighthouse, which is a star. It's not that original, but it's a metaphor that's there. It works. Prominent and tall. This starting a sentence with two adjectives is something that good writers often do. The white structure seemed to look down at the wild sea in disgust. So this isn't just a personification, but this writer develops their personification here. So in disgust and embarrassment, like a parent, it should be to a delinquent child. So hopefully you can see how that personification is really extended, whereas here we just got two short ones. So there's a big clue to you. If you can extend your metaphor, your personification, you're going to get higher marks. Right, let's check out the next paragraph. Rugged black rocks guarded the coastline, joined to one another by all the imperfect ways, each getting filled perhaps, getting filled with liquid, and some collapsing into the water. Deep grey dints emerged in the rocks as the water claws at them. So some much better description here. The examiner likes these sentence forms So we can see that the writer is deliberately starting each sentence in a different way. That's an easy trick for you to do. What they won't like is this introduction of the present tense clause happens now, and so it's imprecise because everything else has been happening in the past. Danced, see? Everything's been in the past so far. Well, let's see what the control is like here. Disobediently, the sea followed the orders of the wind and danced erratically to its tune. So, although that's a slight cliche, it is all in metaphor, and again you've got this spelling of difficult words that the writer is showing off. And like this writer, you've got a variety of ways to start sentences here with an adverb. The wind swept across the sea with the strength and speed that could tear the sky like a discarded tissue. So not a bad simile there. Quite odd that the sea could tear the sky. It makes you think a bit. Oh right, I got interrupted there, sorry, so we're back up here. The strips of white now wrestled with the dreary abundance of cloud. So we've got, again, a detailed personification, yearning for the chance to glide across the sky. And you can see how this candidate has again developed that personification. Yet the constant dark sheet remained merciless and cold. So very good use of contrast there. And contrast is the main technique I teach my students for getting the top grades. Denying any light through the barriers of gloom. So, we've got a range of developed complex ideas. That's the personification again. It kind of builds to a fitting end. And the examiner says overall, it's got convincing communication. There's lots of elements where we can see the student is clearly trying to craft it. There's a range of developed complex ideas, even though it's pretty short, isn't it, to match the purpose of a description. The accuracy is quite high, so 14 out of 16. Sentence demarcation is secure. There have been no punctuation mistakes that we've spotted. Lots of vocabulary that has impressed the examiner with highly accurate spelling. So 14 out of 16 is actually an even higher mark than 20 out of 24 here. And I've shown you why the candidate might not have got higher marks there, because not every paragraph counted and there was a little bit of cliche. So let's come back across to our other candidate. The lighthouse stood firmly and bravely, not letting the bullets of rain take away its new coat of paint. So again, a good metaphor here, but you can see that the examiner's not really convinced by it. Bullets wouldn't take away a coat of paint. What would they? They'd pockmark it, or crater it, or so the metaphor doesn't quite fit what the writer wants it to do. The white was as bright as the light from above. That's really kind of meaningless bit of description, and it's just the sort of thing that you throw in to show you're describing, but it doesn't actually fit what you're writing about, and so that's a real sign of weakness. Never chuck in descriptive techniques just because they're there. They always have to add to what you're describing. There has to be a reason for them. How do they bring the scene to life? And the red was as deep as our blood. That's dreadful, isn't it? That's a terrible cliche. Red was the colour of blood. Like, who cares? We all know that. So avoid that. Again, this is a student who's just thinking, oh no, I've got to put a simile in. And that's not been successful. Windows were clear and clean. The light above ordered the perimeter, so much better use of vocabulary here, as far as it could. Never had it let a boat sink, and tonight was the same. Or could it change? So the or could it change, again, is something that the writer's just stuck in to kind of create a cliffhanger. Well, it's a description. You don't need a cliffhanger, and there's nothing wrong with having that sort of positive ending. Psychologically, It may be that the examiner is expecting something that does not have a positive ending. This one obviously ends in gloom because it comes directly from this picture. And of course, the examiner could be prejudiced. They've looked at the picture and are therefore expecting something gloomy, and therefore they react against something that's positive instinctively without even thinking about it. So we've got clear communication, generally matched to descriptive purpose. So where I've shown you cliche or similes that are just there for the sake of it, or alliteration that's just there for the sake of it, that's where it's not matched to purpose. Yes, it's describing, but actually it's not a description that holds together, that, you know, all the parts of the description have to be there for it to be communicated really well. Yes, the vocabulary is well chosen, lots of linguistic devices, all in paragraphs. Don't forget that, many writers, even good writers, do. With one particularly effective use of a structural feature. So that was the personification here. I think that's a bit harsh myself, but that's the reality of exams. So do you remember I said to you, the examiner's made up their mind here? That, I think, has clearly happened here. We've spent longer reading this than the examiner would. I think it's got more than one example of crafting through the personifications. So I would disagree passionately, but that's the nature of English exams. Another person would disagree with me. It's easier to disagree if you've got rubbish handwriting, or if you've included a description that's got no business being there. Variety of sentence forms for effect, yes. There's been a few mistakes in the sentences and obviously a few mistakes in the spelling. So hopefully seeing these two side by side has given you an idea of what the examiners are looking for. You might well have read this and thought, oh, well, it's all using descriptive techniques, it must be really good. Hopefully you've read this one and seen that the descriptive techniques have to really work, especially how this writer develops their personification. So it has lots of parts to it. And finally, you might be encouraged to see that, look, there's hardly any writing here. That's basically one page and a tiny bit. So quality is what's going to count. You've got time to craft it. Actually, I think you've got time to write something better and longer. So there you have it. If you found that useful, please subscribe. Check out my link below to my revision guide. If you use that, it takes you straight to it, where I show you how to write much better than this, actually, and get 100%.